thought we might start by, we each came to write about art and women artists from different directions. And I wonder if we could just sort of talk about what brought us to art. Roxana, you were working at Sotheby's when Georgia O'Keeffe died.
I wasn't actually working at Sotheby's then, but I did work at Sotheby's for a number of years in the American Paintings department, which was, in my mind, the best. I was a cataloger, which meant that I worked with the paintings, and it meant that whenever we had a great painting to sell, it was my responsibility to do all the research on it and to present the work in its best possible light, which was just like a dream come true. I spent my time reading about John Singer Sargent or John Singleton Copley, or every single great artist that we sold, I got to spend time reading about and thinking about. So I became enamored of all the artists that we sold, and I became very scholarly about them, read everything I could find. But it wasn't, so I started writing about those painters for different magazines and publications. But it wasn't until, and I couldn't write about O'Keeffe. At that time, this was the 70s, you couldn't write about O'Keeffe because you couldn't get permission to use the images. They were held very tightly. O'Keeffe, because of Stieglitz, had been very conscious of the fact that it was important and it was valuable to own the rights to images. So she had kept the rights to all the paintings, and you couldn't reproduce them. And you had to write to her and ask permission and tell her what you were writing about, and I think maybe give a sample. So that there were people who wrote PhD theses and weren't allowed to reproduce a single image in them. And you couldn't get an interview with her because she just wouldn't do it. So there was practically nothing written on O'Keeffe, and so everybody was kind of salivating and dying to do it. And so I wrote about Arthur Dove, I wrote about Charles Sheeler, I wrote about other people in that group, but I couldn't really write about her because I couldn't get the images. So I had started writing about these people, and then I left Sotheby's and moved out to the country, and I was writing fiction. And I had really been writing about art history because I couldn't get my fiction published in the beginning. I was writing both, and I was publishing the art history. And my husband came home one day, and he'd been on the train with a friend of ours, a man called Edward Burlingame, who was then head of the trade division at Harper & Row. And Tony said, I came out on the train with Edward, and he said, you know, Georgia O'Keeffe has just died, and there isn't a good biography of her. Who do you think we should get to write it? So my husband knows a cue when he hears it, and he said, you should ask Roxana. And Edward said, well, I know she writes fiction, but we need somebody who has written about art history. And Tony said, but she has.
Yes.
She's written all these essays. And so Edward said, oh, well, I didn't know that. Thank you for telling me. So Tony came home and said, I've had this conversation with Edward. So, and I said, well, you know, thank you for making that suggestion, but let me explain. Edward is being nice. This is Harper & Row. They need somebody who's the head of the Whitney or the curator at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. They are not going to get me, who I don't even have an art degree. I'm nobody. So he is being nice. He is certainly not going to ask me. And that's one. And two is I'm now publishing my fiction. And I have decided to give up writing about art. I'm not going to write about art anymore. I can't do both. And fiction is my true love. And so that's what I'm going to do. I've already decided that. So A, he won't ask me. And B, if he did ask me, I would say no. Tony said, well, just thought I'd pass on the message. I said, thank you. And that was on Friday, and on Monday, Edward called up and said, would you be interested in writing the life of Georgia O'Keeffe? And I said, yes. So that's how it happened. And I've never written that down. I only tell it when people ask. So that's a private piece of information.
Makes perfect sense. So Don, you came to this a different direction. No one asked you to write a book about Georgia O'Keeffe, did they?
No. And I was actually 60 pages into another novel when I saw a show of her abstractions in 2009 at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And that show for me was a revelation as I realized that O'Keeffe in her late 20s, was really one of the first American artists, male or female, who was exploring pure abstraction in her art. And her abstract work of that time, which is the late teens, early 20s, and the abstractions that she continued to make throughout her life, there were these bold, glowing, intellectual and visceral, shapes of color and form, and they were fiercely original. And I was curious about this. I wanted to know who was the woman who made these shapes. What did she think, feel, want? What was happening in her life during this period of time? And also in that exhibit, and some of you may have seen it, but also in that show, her abstractions were paired with Alfred Stieglitz's photographs of her that were done as part of a serial portrait that spanned 20 years of their 30-year relationship. And also there were excerpts from the letters that they had exchanged, were at that time still unpublished. They were published in 2011. But the language of those letters was fascinating to me. It was sharply intimate. It was, raw with a kind of nuanced intensity. And again, I wanted to know who was the young artist who wrote those letters, and also, this art. Why have I never seen the full range and scope of her abstract work before, all in one place? Why isn't she known primarily for the innovations that she was making in abstraction, really before too many other American artists were bold enough to be exploring that what was a relatively new language of art. And so I began to, when I left the Whitney that day, I had this sense of here's a woman that, we all know of, and yet there are these corners of her life, there are these pockets of her life as a young artist that are less well known. And as I began to research, as I began to kind of look into her story, I actually read 3 biographies in a row right after I left the Whitney in that first month. And I noticed there were these little tiny discrepancies between the various biographies. And there were also, one of the things I love about Roxana's biography is that, I feel like it stays so close to the facts, but not every biography did. There was there were clearly interpretations of, and I was really curious about this, and it became clear to me that there was all this mythology that had been built up around this woman, and I wanted to know, who was Georgia O'Keeffe, and who was she again as that young artist in the years. The novel really spans the years 1916 to 1933, which were years when O'Keeffe was living with Stieglitz in New York, and they were really splitting their time between New York City and Lake George. And that period of time, that span of years, was was a kind of crucible for O'Keeffe. Those were the years where her art was first discovered. Those were the years where she fell in love, craved a child, was betrayed, where she became famous, where she first went to New Mexico. And those were the years where she made key innovations in her art and really profound sacrifices in her life, and where she met and overcame the challenges of significant gender bias, and went on to really forge and shape the direction of her art and her career and her life on her own terms, and that made her story feel so intensely relevant to in that span of life of her during that span of her life, intensely relevant to women and artists today. And so that's the story that I wanted to write into.
Interesting listening to Roxana and Don talk about Georgia O'Keeffe. I sort of found myself thinking about how Georgia O'Keeffe was the most famous American artist, woman artist, that if you ask people, about a great American woman painter, they would name Georgia O'Keeffe and not name so many others. So I became really interested in writing about women artists who did achieve success. One of the women in my book is Louise Nevelson, who was a superstar in her time and was quickly erased, mysteriously omitted from art histories, especially in the 90s after she passed away. And I found myself discovering other women artists who also, during their lifetime, were famous, did many interviews, had shows, won awards, and after their deaths were just forgotten. And so I became, it was sort of like, you know, the anti-O'Keefe, like what other artists are there that really are just as interesting? I mean, they didn't have an Alfred Stieglitz in their life. And we can talk about image and how women artists present themselves. It's really part of all their stories. But they had attained a lot of recognition and then were quickly erased and forgotten. And it became very interesting to me to try to figure out why. And I felt in a lot of ways, Louise Nevelson, who was the most famous, was sort of O'Keefe's opposite. She stayed in New York. She was very flamboyant, lived a really kind of passionate, messy kind of life, as opposed to Georgia O'Keeffe, who left New York City and went to New Mexico, and became cast almost as like an art nun, sort of a saint. She became very pure, and people's, in their symbolic interpretation of her, in spite of the fire in her work, she herself became very austere and sort of a clean figure, whereas Nevelson was incredibly messy and complicated and a little outrageous and hung out with Andy Warhol and had false eyelashes out to here and wore many layers of clothes. She was like a Russian warrior queen. And I think that all that almost did her in a way, as being taken seriously as an artist as soon as she died. Her very good friend, Edward Albee, the playwright, wrote about her, wrote a play shortly after her death, sort of talking about how she would remain this outsider. That it's called The Occupant. And she was in the hospital and she didn't want her name on the door. So that sort of already looking towards being forgotten. It was such an interesting story. So that was the first artist that I wrote about. Sort of try to add to our list of women artists.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of her in terms of her flamboyance. I think part of it, all these things that we've been talking about, nothing is absolutely cut and dried. I think part of it is that, as far as I know, Nevelson did that one thing that was so powerful and important, but she didn't do the next thing. So it was just those boxes, black boxes and white boxes. Although you're going to tell me that's
yeah,
wrong.
Okay. Right. I will object.
Okay, but
I know what you mean.
So, and most artists don't, by the way. Most artists do one thing, and they're famous for that one thing. Picasso did about 5, but most artists have done one thing for which they're famous. But what interested me is the body, is that she dressed so flamboyantly, and that's what Peggy Guggenheim did, and it's what a lot of women artists have done, because it may be hard for some women to separate their inner lives from their outer lives. And so women are always so aware of their physical presentation that becomes part of who they are as a labor lawyer or an artist or whatever their inner lives are. And so that would do you in if you were demanding that people look at you as a body, particularly once you were no longer 25. That would interfere with you being seen as a serious artist.
It's so interesting that you say that. Each of the artists in my book, sort of address that in some way, and several of them use themselves as subjects. It's a commonplace to say that women were subjects of art long before they were allowed to be artists, and that I was talking to a friend today about when I would go to museums as a girl, I would see women in paintings, often without clothes on, but not see women painters. I didn't see their names on the wall. And so when women became artists and chose to paint, to legitimize women's lives as subjects for art and use themselves for that, it was a very radical approach. Joan Brown did that, a Bay Area painter, for instance, and kind of told the story of her life in paintings in a way that just hadn't been done before. And people reacted very negatively to a lot of that. It was okay when it was family life, but when she explored her spiritual interests and other intellectual pursuits, critics weren't as happy with her as when she was doing abstract work or family portraits. So, it's a constant back and forth, and that male artists just haven't had to deal with in the same way, I think.
And I think that O'Keefe, though, I think she was very clear. Her own sense of style was so, and there's a show that's coming to Brooklyn, right? Is that up yet?
It's not up
about
yet.
her clothes, but she was very clear in her presentation. she was clear in her presentation when she was a student, and she would make her own clothes, and she would wear the buckram belt. Your biography really spans her life, So you'll be able to kind of be more of a resource on this. But she was very specific about what she wore always, and very specific about the way she presented herself. And I think but in a sense, it was like almost creating that like demarcation.
She was very clear about it. She knew exactly how she wanted to present herself, but it wasn't as a woman, really. She wasn't doing what Nevelson did. She would never have put on false eyelashes.
Right.
Oh, she went the other direction.
She said,
really.
"I don't want you to think of me in that way. I'm going to be neat and trim and always clean, and my white collar and cuffs." By the way, for about 5 years, I only wore black and white. I just couldn't stop. And so this is an homage to Georgia. She always looked trim and perfect. But there's a picture of her in Vogue or something like that in the 20s, and there's a sort of a collage of women, pictures of everybody. And who is it? There's another woman artist, and she is clearly acting the bohemian, and I think she's wearing fingerless gloves or something like that. And she is presenting herself as an artist, and OKeefe doesn't do it. She's got the little prim bun, and she's got a lace collar. Her dress is not very low. She's just not going to go there. She's not going to give you the opportunity to think of her body. That's not what she's doing there. So it was very interesting, and one of her students, when she was in Texas, so this is 1915, said she dressed like a man. Because she wanted to be able to walk on the prairie, that's why she was there. So she wore shoes. They weren't men's shoes, but they were solid and comfortable. And she wore black and white suits, and she didn't wear pants, but she dressed in a way that said, I'm not what you want me to be. I am who I am.
Well, she was always very specific about how she presented herself and the angles of her dress. I mean, there was, they had very clear artistic, clean lines,
Yes, totally true. But I'll tell you something else that I don't think I put in the book, and this made me laugh. So I went out to Santa Fe, to Abiquiu, and I interviewed Jerry Newsom, who was one of her favorite housekeepers in Abiquiu for a long time. And when I met Jerry, she was living she was lovely. She lived in a trailer park, and she brought me in and she said, well, I'll tell you whatever you want to know. She was great. And she said, I have some of her dresses. And I said, no, I didn't know that. Can I see them? And she said, yes. And they were wraparound. They were like a pioneer woman's dress. I mean, from the 1950s. I mean, scoop neck, little tiny narrow turquoise and white stripes, and kind of skirt on the cut on the bias. It was it was just the most boring housewifey. And she said she loved these, and if she liked a dress, she would get 5 of them. And so I think they came from Bonwitz or something, and she said, okay.
We just saw Stieglitz shop too.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, but so the photographs that Stieglitz takes of her are the complete opposite of this.
Absolutely.
So how did that affect her work and her reception? I mean, both of you write about that from, you from factual and you very interpretive. I mean, that changed everything for her.
Do you want to start?
You want to start?
Why don't you start? I've just been talking.
So what your question is specifically like how the photographs affected her art. I mean, I think the photographs were really key to mention. There was a lot of chemistry in their relationship, and a lot of that chemistry is played out in the early part of their relationship. There's a lot of passion between them. It's a sexual passion. It's also a creative passion. It's intellectual. It's philosophic. Like it's all wrapped in together. And the photographs are a really key dimension of that relationship in the early stages. And when Stieglitz first started to show the photographs, when OKeefe first saw the photographs, she fell in love with them, and he would tease her, you're falling in love with yourself. But she was fascinated by the forms, and she was fascinated by the art. She really saw the photographs as art. I believe she really saw the photographs as art, and she was in love with his art. I mean, his art was exceptional. It was just it's phenomenal. And when he first began to show the photographs, he showed them in these smaller, salon settings. So he would show them to other artists, and he would show them in conjunction with showing some of her early abstractions that she was making at the same time, because their relationship really galvanized the work of both artists. And then the kind of the list of who he invited to their makeshift studio changed, and he was showing the art to collectors and and some critics, but people were still seeing those photographs, many of them nude, as art. And so I don't think that she really anticipated, when she agreed to the show in 1921, where it was a retrospective of Stieglitz's work, and it included, I'm trying to remember how many of her, I think it was at least 40. It was a lot of photographs of her, her face, her hands. It was a woman unnamed, but everyone knew who it was. And I think she really expected the photographs to be seen as art, and they were seen as art, but also as documents, as personal documents of their affair, and it was so public, it was suddenly. I think it was Henry McBride who was a critic at the time, and he talked about how she became a celebrity overnight. But she became a celebrity. He had not shown her work in a major show yet. That was 2 years later in 1923. And it was such a public showing, the photographs. And I don't think that she was expecting how personal it would suddenly become, and how the language that sexualized language that was associated with the photographs would then get wrapped around her art two years later, and would really help shape the critical interpretation of her art.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I mean, one of the interesting things about those images is they're not idealized. So if you allowed somebody to take photographs of you nude, you would want your best profile, right? You would want those images to reveal you at your best. And these images don't do that. They're not idealized. And she looks awkward in some of them, and uncomfortable, and her body isn't perfect. And I don't think she cared. She was, just as Dawn said, she understood that she was participating in a work of art, and that he was the artist, and she was simply participating in that. And I think she reveled in the idea of being part of it at that moment. And later it became a burden to her, and she began to resent it. But at that time, when they were passionately in love, it was, you have a sense from the photographs. They're both tremendously delighted by this relationship, and art is part of it. The bodies are part of it, and art is part of it. And it's also so gendered. It's impossible to imagine the reverse of this. It's impossible to imagine Georgia taking photographs of naked Alfred. It's just But this is the history of art. It's naked women, and in this picture, the woman represents Minerva, and in this picture, or this statue, she's Minerva. In another one, she's Europa. But we're used to seeing women as art, naked women as art, and so part of that was that this was the tradition that OKeefe was a part of, and I agree. She wasn't ready for this eruption of kind of delighted voyeurism that took place after that first exhibition. It was a time when Stieglitz didn't have a gallery, so this was an exhibition put on in the Anderson galleries, and so it was suddenly a huge venue that everybody knew about, and boom, it exploded.
And it was also something he had wanted to do. You know, it was interesting to me when I was doing my research, and I realized that this was something he had wanted to do. He had wanted to document a woman over time. Like, that was something he had wanted to do it with his daughter. He had done it with his mistress Paula when he was in Berlin for a short span of time. But this was something that was really part of his his vision for his own his own art and the trajectory of his art. And she she became that, she fit into that role and that, that kind of, artistic task, that he had set for himself earlier, before he met her.
Now I'm thinking of one of the artists that I wrote about in my book, Christina Ramberg.
Yeah.
This was a Chicago artist who early on started painting these really astonishing canvases. They were in acrylic. They were the perfectly flat surface. You could see any brush strokes. And she was very inspired by the way comics depicted characters, especially like the gleams in the hair and the dark outline around the body. I mean, they were very classically beautiful, but also had this sort of pulp side to them. And she painted women wearing corsets, and they called them Merry Widow, those chemise tops, and almost like S&M kind of black, shiny satin and leather, lots of lace. And she never painted faces. And so it was sort of from here down, wearing boots and in submissive sort of poses. There's one she called Lady in Waiting, and she's bent over. It's very sexual, and yet in a very artificial sort of way. But they were absolutely baffling to people who knew Christina, because she was, the words people used to describe her were wholesome and sunny, and she was a teacher. She was very warm and very friendly, but she was exploring these really dark, mysterious aspects of female sexuality. She drew and painted hands that were often tied and twisted and bonded. She painted feet, sort of forced into really high heels in the way that feet become so distorted, almost like wrapping feet, the Chinese tradition. She painted heads that were muffled and hooded and all these, really difficult things. And they were so mysterious, and you could never tell where she was, what she was looking for in these. But it's sort of an interesting progression of thinking about how women were depicted by men and how a woman would take what looked like male perspective on a woman's body. And I came to feel that some of these were more like armor than vulnerable, that they weren't submissive so much as almost like aggressively sexual, like, look at these powerful bodies, and I'm gonna wear things with studs and openings and really pointy bras, and that they were almost like weaponry. And so she sort of turned it around. It was really interesting and dynamic, and people were just really struck by it. And still, you go in the Art Institute of Chicago, there's one of those pictures, and people just stand there and gaze at them in amazement.
One of the things that really struck me when I was reading your book is the unwillingness of so many of the artists that you write about to be pinned down into a very specific, didn't want to be a watercolorist, didn't want to be called a portraitist, like wanted that freedom.
Yeah.
To kind of self-define and to evolve. And that was really interesting to me. And and it also felt true to OKeefe in the way, she would have interviews sometimes, and she would be asked, well, so you're like a surrealist? And she'd be like, no, no, and it was just that, and when, and even when she became, in many, a real figure of the feminist movement, she didn't want to be associated with an ism. And I always found that so interesting, and I found it so interesting to read about the women that you write about, and that kind of reluctance to be pinned down, reluctance to be pinned into a very specific. And I find in my own life as a writer, like I want that freedom. I want that freedom to be not just a novelist, but who knows? Like, do you know what I mean? It might be poetry, it might be some kind of amalgam of different creative endeavors. But I just think that was really something that struck me. It struck me also with regard to Leonore.
Lenore Tawney.
The textile artist, and she was doing weaving, and she was making like these open weaves, and and then she started to make the boxes.
Right.
And just that kind of that need to change, that drive to change, because isn't that what art is? That kind of need to continually, dig in and reach and risk and make bold choices, again and again, and allow your style to evolve.
It's so true. I mean, art really is about freedom. And listening, I mean, I really appreciate you saying this, and it reminds me too that they also didn't want to be pinned down as women. I mean, they
Right.
didn't want to be just a wife or just a mother, and some of them were. And they didn't want to just be women. I mean, all of them hated being described as a woman artist. Lois Smiley Jones also hated being described as an African-American woman artist.
Well, can you
All
talk
these
a little bit
categories.
about her journey? Because that was another fascinating
About
chapter
Lois.
to me, because this was a woman who, and you'll speak to it better than I will, but this was a woman who, she achieved great, she was celebrated in Paris. But when she came back to the States, she, her work, because her work was not accepted unless she submitted it anonymously.
Yes, this is Lois Smiley Jones. She was born in Boston. Really interesting family background. Middle class, upper middle class, but African American. Went to art school. She was quite a prodigy, very talented, and ended up at Howard University. Well, she, even as a student, was always told, think about helping your people. I mean, who says that to artists? The world was so segregated. She would often be the only a student of color at the Boston Fine Arts Museum. She did go down south and helped start a school down there. But she ended up at Howard University. She was very clever in her ways of getting people to recognize her work. And she was able to get a sabbatical in Paris and immediately felt free there. So many artists, James Baldwin and Richard Wright, and she knew Josephine Baker, the great entertainer who was there, because it just wasn't a racially segregated society. I mean, it was just much more cosmopolitan and open. And she loved Impressionism, and she painted these beautiful, lush, Parisian sort of paintings. And when she came back to America with this work and continued her academic career at Howard, she could not submit her work to museums in Washington, D.C., which is, of course, where she was living because she was at Howard. African-American artists were not allowed to compete in group shows in the 1940s. After World War II, where people fought overseas, and African-American nurses served, and this was so painful to her. But rather than just be pained, she asked a white friend of hers to submit her work. And she also did things where she would mail her work in and just use her initials, and who knew who she was, and she would win prizes. I mean, these were magnificent paintings. And she fortunately lived long enough to get an official apology from the National, I think
How
it was
many
the
years
National
later?
Portrait.
It
was like 40 years later.
Yeah.
And you can read, and they published this, and you can find it online, and they apologized to her for treating her that way, and it's a heartbreaking story. But I will say, as vicious as the racism one, that Lois said to the end of her life that the burden that was the toughest for her was being a woman. That it was worse than being a female artist than being a black artist, which really tells you something. But she, as Don was saying, she was always switching up her style. She was such a global person. She traveled all over the world. She was really an art ambassador, self-appointed. Went all over Africa and started making paintings that were based on the patterns in African textiles. She was fascinated by masks and theater. She married an artist from Haiti and spent many years going back and forth to Haiti, and has a series of paintings of Haitian markets and based on the voodoo religion, some of the imagery from that. So she was always evolving and always changing, very, very courageously. Thank you for that. Any other thoughts?
I think that one of the things that that struck me reading about these artists, but also reading about OKeefe, was she had extraordinary vision. She had a revolutionary vision that was really just, and there was so much range in her work, but it was also her tenacity, and her drive. And Roxana, your book covers the whole arc of her life, and really captures. I feel like in your biography you really capture how the landscape, the passages about her relationship to the landscape and the landscape that she, and how that fueled her art, but also you really capture that sense of drive, the way she, for lack of a better word, persisted.
Well, she, My own sense of it was that it wasn't that she wanted to be famous. She wasn't determined to enter museum shows and win prizes. That wasn't the point for her. And so when she went out to Texas, I think that was 1913, the first time she went, she really went for the landscape. She wanted to get somewhere where it was completely open and she could see the sky. And she had a friend in school who was from Texas, and that's why she went. And she didn't care if anybody knew her there or looked at her work. And throughout her life, she said at one point, I think it was around 1918, she said, I always knew that I could teach and I could support myself doing that. And so I didn't care if I sold my work or not. And Stieglitz did that. And Stieglitz is the person who made her famous. And Stieglitz always kept her prices high. Even in the Depression, when everybody else was selling for 25 cents, he wouldn't sell her work unless it brought the prices he wanted. Unless he felt like it, then he would. Because when Barbara was doing the catalog raisonné of O'Keefe, she said she found pictures that no one had seen, since 1940. And somebody would come in. Stieglitz was very, very unpredictable about who he would sell to. He hated museums. He hated Europe. He hated rich people. So he was completely just quixotic. But if you came in and you were a postal clerk and you said, that is a painting I must have in my life, he would say, how much, and you'd say, I can't pay $400. And he'd say, how much could you pay each month? Could you pay $2 a month? And you'd say, I can pay $2. And he'd say, it's yours. And he'd give it to you. So Barbara found people who were living in walk-up apartments who had no money and had this picture on the wall since 1940 and had no idea that it was worth $2 million. Because it was somebody that had come in and had connected so powerfully to the work that Stieglitz would sell it. But apart from all those people, he kept O'Keefe's prices very high, which had a very powerful effect on the way the art world treated her. So we were talking earlier about how gender affects your presence as an artist. And Stieglitz was, to his great credit, he did lots of things that I'm angry at him for, but he was absolutely devoted to the idea of supporting the work of this artist. And he was a very mercurial figure, very flamboyant. And so he was a big presence in the art world, and he was asked in the 1920s by the curators at the Philadelphia Museum of Art if he would send down his artists because they wanted to do a show of modern art. And they said, but don't send any women artists. Send us the other ones. Send us the real artists. And he said, if you don't take O'Keefe, I'm not giving you anybody else. And that was just the way he felt. She was a great artist. She was just as good as Demuth and Sheeler and Dove, and he said, this is my stable and this is who I'm representing. He also sort of idolized her and put her on an incredible pedestal, as you can see from some of the photographs, and you've seen in the letters, he says she's like a great white child. She's light, she's a Georgia, I can't believe she's in my life. So there was a sort of an adoration that was part of this. And it was both very important to O'Keefe as an artist because it allowed her to be out there in Texas, and she would do these astonishing watercolors, and she'd stick them into a tube, and she'd put a 4-cent stamp on it and send them all off to Stieglitz, and because she could get them out of her house and just get them off her table. And then he said, "This is a genius," but she wasn't there. Like Louise Nevelson, she wasn't going to the openings and talking to the critics and making sure that she had on her eyelashes so that everybody knew that she was in the room. That was the last thing she wanted. And it wasn't that she wanted to be austere, she wanted to be in the place that allowed her to work. And that's why she left New York when Stieglitz died.
And it's also why she stayed with him. I mean, that was a really, a number of the women in your work, leave their domestic life, leave the cultural and societal expectations that marriage brings. But she was very deliberate about staying with Stieglitz. I mean, I think she loved him.
Absolutely.
But I also think that he took care. He swept up a lot of those details that she did not want. She wanted to make art. That she wanted that was what she loved to do. And there was a very, their relationship did shift a bit, after in the kind of, mid to late 1930s, and it shifted a bit. The terms of their relationship shifted a bit, but there was still, this, I don't think she ever loved anyone else.
No, I don't either.
And I don't think, I think there's been a lot of conjecture about various other relationships she had. If I had to put money on it, I would say I don't think she really had any other love affairs or any significant love affairs. I think that he was it, but their relationship did shift a bit. And he really kept that business piece. He ran her, he controlled that, or he ran that piece on her behalf. And she would say later in her life, she said, I'm trying to remember where she said it, but she said, with Stieglitz, I always came first, and I like to be first.
And she also, I agree with all of that, and also it wasn't, Stieglitz certainly protected her work as an artist, and that's why he didn't want to have children. He forbade her from having children, which she actually wanted to do. And he was convinced that if she had children, she wouldn't paint, which was maybe have been true, but it actually wasn't his decision, but he thought it was.
If she was married to him, maybe it would have been tough to do both.
Are you saying because he was a child?
It might easily have been tough, but it just wasn't his decision, is all I'm saying. But one of the things that I was always interested to watch was the way OKeefe, she was a very good housekeeper, everyone said that, but she set things up so she wouldn't have to do a lot of housekeeping. And so when she moved into that building at the Shelton Towers, if you read the quotes, there's a dining room. She doesn't have to cook. So they go, and they have lots of friends, and Stieglitz wants to have dinner with friends, and they go down to the dining room. She does not have to be that person who figures out what they're going to have for dinner every night. So she just steps back from that, although everybody said she could clean a room perfectly. She loved to cook, actually. She enjoyed cooking. She loved the ingredients of cooking. She loved gardening. But she didn't want to be that person, and Stieglitz let her do that. He welcomed that.
That theme of being an artist, but also having to run a household of some sort, it comes up a lot in the stories I tell about these 7 women artists. Many of them really had conflicts about that. Some of the artists that had children were not the best mothers. Gertrude Abercrombie was a Chicago artist who, her husband had to do everything in the house. Her first husband finally had to hire someone. Gertrude just couldn't do it. She had to paint. And, she loved her daughter, but she was not a very good mother because she was just always painting and thought her daughter should just take care of herself, kind of. So in each of those stories, it became really interesting to me to try to track, how do relationships fit in. Joan Brown was a mother she had a horrible childhood, a bizarrely unhappy childhood. Her parents were dysfunctional in many ways. So she wanted a much happier life, and she had one child, a son, whom she adored, and she retreated from her studio, moved into a place where she could paint at home to be with Noel so that he was close to her and part of her life. And it was a very joyous source of inspiration for her, and you can see this in her paintings when he's young, and they stayed very close. So each woman, each artist, either gender, but particularly for women, has to figure that out. What role do other people play in your life? Do you do the housework or not? And how do you fit that in and also earn a living? Art is such a physical thing. As someone who tried to make art and just the practical side of it, so difficult. How do you have space for it? How do you afford materials? Louise Nevelson would go out in the middle of the night and cruise the streets looking for cast-offs, for wood, for old pallets, for things that people threw out, broken chairs, toilets, anything she could find because she had no money. Mm-hmm. And each of these women had to make that decision. Do I put household first so that I have a nice place? What do I do for my kid? Or do I buy paint? Joan Brown used house paints for a while because it was cheaper and she was living out in the country. all those decisions and how that shapes your art and your sense of your identity as an artist. Very tricky.
That question of O'Keefe with a child, though, it was really my entire relationship to her story actually changed when I read the letters. The letters were published in 2011, and I actually rewrote the first third of the book. And the first third of the book is racy. I wasn't intending to write a racy book. I'm not really interested in writing a racy book, but I felt like the letters had a certain, and the letters are actually in places much more explicit and graphic than what I've written. But one of the things, but the letters really did reshape how I thought about that period of time in her life. And there was one thing that really leapt out to me, and that was there was an early letter that he sent to her that Stieglitz sent to her when she was still in Texas, and he wrote along the edge of it, what kind of child would we have? Would the two of us together have? And that was a very powerful. O'Keefe really wanted a child. And that was a very powerful thing for her. That was something that was alluded to in their early letters when he was still married, when she was living in Texas and he was in New York. And then I found another letter that he sent to her in 1929 when she had gone out to New Mexico, and he wrote in a letter, we should have had a child. I see that now. I was wrong. And I'll tell you, that was hard. That was hard as a writer. For me, I had trouble with him. And actually my first draft reflected that. My husband read it and he said, you don't like Stieglitz, but you don't like him on page 3. So, but that dynamic was a really tough one. For me to come to terms with and to reshape the book so that we do fall in love with Stieglitz, so that I fell in love with Stieglitz, and actually did that by reading a biography that his great niece had written, and spending more time with his art and really thinking about the way, as Roxana said, he really did hold her up. He really held her as equal to the other artists in their circle in a way that I don't really think any other man who had the degree of influence that he had. But that piece about the child and seeing those two letters, and I actually went back, to compare, to see those 2 points in their relationship where a child had been alluded to in a letter, and to sense kind of the tension around that.
He's easy to dislike. If you're a feminist in any way, it's very easy to cast him as the villain because of these things. And because of the public affair he seemed to have had with Dorothy Norman, and he was so unkind to O'Keefe when he was having that affair. But what's important to remember, and I interviewed one man who was an opera singer, I think, and he had known Stieglitz, and he said that I can't remember where this encounter took place, but Stieglitz saw this man and something like bowed or took his hand, and he said, "You are an artist." And this man said what he did was just fill you with this belief and this excitement about this endeavor that you were both engaged in. And so it's hard for us to understand that, but he was tremendously charismatic. And I believe that he loved women. He really loved women. He couldn't keep his hands off them sometimes. But it was not because he saw them as prey. He wasn't a predator. He really loved them. I think he loved Dorothy Norman, which is a big mistake in my view. But he absolutely loved Georgia, and he was mortified after the affair with Dorothy Norman. And O'Keefe had a nervous breakdown, and he was afraid she would die, and it was seen as a possibility, and it would be his fault. So things did change drastically after that, and I think he spent the rest of his life being ashamed of it. But they did. O'Keefe was generous, and he really did love her, and they went through that. And she wrote in letters that you've both seen that. If she really took responsibility for her own happiness, and it was part of her Midwestern sort of agrarian background. You are responsible for your life. No one else is responsible for it. If you're unhappy, shape up or stay unhappy. It's no one else's fault. And she thought If Stieglitz wants to have an affair, I can still go to the Southwest every summer and absorb this incredible light and beauty and landscape. I'm going to do my own paintings. And I think they didn't discuss it. They didn't discuss Dorothy Norman for a while until she had the nervous breakdown. But she charged herself with leading the kind of life she wanted to live. And Stieglitz loved her for most of the time. Little blip, didn't. Back again, did. And they created something together that was very powerful and nourishing for both of them. So I give him great credit for seeing the world in a way that made it larger for everyone, and doing an enormous, I won't call it favor, it wasn't a favor, but giving OKeefe the kind of stature that she deserved in the world,
Right.
and by loving her.
Right.
So I find him someone I do feel very positive about, although he was infuriating, but unlike all the rest of us, right? The rest of us don't have flaws.
So I'm curious, in wrapping up, Roxana, your biography came out some time ago, and you then watched sort of the cult of OKeefe evolve. Where do you think we stand now with that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not in charge of it, and I watched, it drives me crazy when people write or do movies of her that are not true to her actual life. So I try not to expose myself to those things. There was a movie made in which she has an abortion, which just drove me crazy, because she would never have had an abortion, and she wrote that, and her sister had an abortion, and it was horrible for her. So but you know, I'm not in charge of OKeefe. People can write whatever they want about OKeefe. So it's gone on and on. I still think the issue of gender is present. So and then there's still critics who feel that her work is decorative, and it's made for tablecloths and all those big flowers. But I think that Dawn's point about the abstraction show, which was a great show, was that we tend to forget the context of her art. And so when she did those big those magnified flowers, no one had done anything like that before. And what she was doing was responding to Paul Strand's magnified abstractions, magnified photographs. And so she was moving in a direction no one had ever made. Now, we all know those images. So we think that they were commonplace, but they weren't. They were radical. So many of the things she did in her career were radical. But there's some people who can't see that, who still persist. And when I was writing the biography and after it came out, I could tell if I was talking to somebody in the art world who just went, OKeefe. And I thought, okay, it's still going on. So.
And yet you have something like the Tate Show last summer, and the goal of that show was the first 100 years after her work was shown for the first time in New York. Have the first retrospective of OKeefe at the Tate, and but the goal of the exhibit was to reassess her place. I'm seeing the quote on the page from the in an interview that the curator did with The Guardian, was to reassess her place in the canon of art, and to reassess her influence on artists who were her contemporaries and also on successive generations of artists. And I think that the OKeefe Museum has done so much to continue to not just to be a repository for her work, but to be an ambassador for her work, and to partner with other museums and with other institutions throughout the world, to just kind of remind all of us of the innovations that she was making, and they were radical and they were groundbreaking.
Well, and the same for the artists, Louise Nevelson, Lenore Tawney, and somehow when you're a woman artist, you just are not seen as a radical artist formally or technically or innovatively. It's always first some sort of story about being a woman, and how amazing, there's a Germaine Greer quote about
Right.
that. It's like some freak of nature that, this woman did this thing, and it must be because she's a woman, and her imagery must be sexual.
Well, there was the only joint show that O'Keefe and Stieglitz were in a few group shows together, but the only joint show that it was just his work and her work was, I think, in 1924. And the reviews, if you read the reviews, because I would go through and I'd read, the reviews, I was really curious to read like the actual reviews. And if you read the reviews, the reviews of his work are about his work. And a lot of the reviews of her work in that same show were about his discovery of her. and that was really telling to me. It was revelatory, to think about how that narrative of a woman's art is still wrapped up, through that lens.
Yeah, and still, I think.
Yeah.
Still, amazingly enough, in this century.
Should we do questions?
Do questions?
Questions? I hope people have questions. Do you have a question, Rosie?
I actually have a question for you, Donna. When I learned that your mother was a painter and that you went to art school, I became really interested in how those things influenced the creation of your book.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, growing up, my mother's generation, it was very difficult for her and many of her peers to give themselves permission to be an artist. My mother was very modest about it, very devoted to it, but family had to come first, the house had to be perfect. Even as she created a co-op for artists, and I grew up in the Hudson Valley just north of here, where at the time there were really no galleries at all. And this was mostly women, not all, not strictly, but just trying to establish an art community and seeking each other out just for some support and way to share ideas and techniques. But there was always this sense that it kind of had to be to the side, and other things had to come first, including children. Whereas when I decided I wanted to go to art school, that I was interested in making art, I had no hesitation. There was no conflict for me. And in speaking with her and kind of watching her reaction to my being able to do something she never was able to, I became very sensitive to that evolution of sort of permission and confidence, really, in shaping your own life aside from any relationships, that was not part of it. In terms of the book, several things went into that. One was, I explained in the beginning that I was a huge reader. I was always very split between the visual and the language, and I think my language skills are stronger. But I would read about artists all the time, and I would look, and this was when, before the internet, and there were these big art history books full of photographs, and there'd be these group photographs of artists, and each male in the photograph was identified. And my title, Identity Unknown, was because there would be the woman, and underneath it would just say, Identity Unknown. Like, who cares? We don't know who this is. And I, as a student, found that really appalling, and it just stayed with me. And then as I watched women artists who had attained some fame not be included in art history books, I became a fiend for indexes. I would get an index for art history and is Nevelson in there? Is Brown in there? Is Tawney in there? Why are they not in here? So that sort of became a part of my mission. And the other thing is that I just love profiles. I grew up reading The New Yorker, those long, rambling profiles of portraits. So I'm sort of between the fiction and the biography, where it's a form where it's factual, but you're sort of allowed essays, you're figuring things out. So that's why that form appeals to me. So thank you. I hope you have other questions. Yes?
So if we're all going to go home and look up a couple of paintings, whether it's an O'Keefe or Nevelson, or what should we be looking at?
Where do I start?
Right
What did you,
before we read your books.
the great thing is that you can find so much art online. It's just really amazing. So, look for Lenore Tawney, look for Christina Ramberg. You'll be amazed at what you see. These are really dynamic, interesting artists. And a lot of O'Keefe's work, depends how familiar you are. Those abstractions are absolutely stunning.
That to me, yeah.
They're I remember
So
seeing
Google
them for the
Georgia
first
O'Keeffe
time.
abstraction.
Yeah. And then look at some Nevelson and find some things that aren't black boxes.
Yeah.
See what you think.
Bad.
I was just at the Agnes Martin, I think it was December, January. A lot of what you're saying about O'Keefe, their styles are different, but just that I also went to the lectures they had about Martin and about the inner life versus, as people were trying to influence or impact their art. Did any of you look at the Martin or?
The Agnes Martin show. Yeah, I know her work well. She was very
She
close.
also looked at Western.
She did.
She
They
did,
didn't
yeah.
seem to have any connection. Everybody would
Connection, but
say, yeah, no, she did. She did. But they didn't. I think Agnes Martin said at one point that she had tried to go and see O'Keefe, and O'Keefe was not particularly receptive. I think they were different generations and very different kind of work, and I think there was a little prickly response.
I have O'Keefe on my bedroom wall.
There you go.
I didn't realize it until.
She bought it in 1941 for $400.
But I just realized it's there. It's always
But
there.
if I were you, if I were looking at O'Keefe, I would look at they're not abstractions, but they're the watercolors she did when she was in Canyon, Texas. And
Gorgeous.
they are as close as you can come to painting with light. They are just astonishing. And she did those. She didn't have a gallery. She didn't have any career. She just would get up in the morning and she would paint the sunrise. She would paint the evening star, and they're just astonishing.
You know, thinking about Agnes Martin, Lenore Tawney, the fiber artist that I write about, they were neighbors in New York, and they were friends. They were very close friends. And some people feel that Agnes Martin's grid was influenced by Lenore's weaving, the warp and the weft and the sort of intersections and that very, very fine detail. So if you, I'd be interested, you know, if you look at some of Lenore Tawney's work, you might see that connection. And Agnes Martin wrote Lenore's first show, which was on Staten Island. Agnes Martin wrote the catalog for it and was just one of, you know, she wrote very beautifully, but these were very expressive responses to her friend's work in fiber. So that dynamic is really interesting.
I'm thinking of the light out west, and even though their works are different, O'Keefe and Martin, they both were influenced by that southwestern light.
It's very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
I might be wrong, but I thought I read in one of the letters, O'Keefe's letters, where she writes about how, as a visual artist, it would have been much more difficult to be a mother than perhaps it would be to be a mother and a writer. And it almost feels in the letter that she's comforting herself for not having had a child, and I couldn't have done both because the creative side of me that needed to go into my work would have been drained from me had I had children or a child. All of you are writers. I don't know if you have children of your own, but but you've written about visual artists. Can you comment on that? Do you think that there's any? It feels to me like it's a justification, but as a writer, that balance must also be part of.
I was actually just talking. I had coffee with my editor right before this, and I was saying that I feel as I've been reflecting on O'Keefe's story, and as I've been talking about it over the last year since the book came out, I often get the question of do you think she could have done both, like had a child and also had a career as a visual artist, and one of the things that's really come to me in a very personal way is that I'm married to a really, really supportive person. And it's not just that he supports the logistics, like, you know, picks the kids up at school and gets them dinner, you know, when I'm working or when I'm doing things. It's that he supports the culture of my work in our home. You know, he really believes in the culture of my work, and that's a tremendous thing. I mean, that is just something that I feel like it's amazing how much you can do when you have a culture in your home around you where you have the whole home is saying, yeah, you can do both, you can have both, and you can make it all work. And to have a family like that, I think, is really what allows you to have that in a way that feels in tune and it, you know, where you're at ease with it, you know, where it's not a negotiation for time, for space, for thought, you know, for that kind of, you know, just that need you have to separate and go off and do your work.
I think that she's right about the visual artist as opposed to the writer. As Donna is saying, there's so much physical stuff that is involved with being an artist, and she always had a separate place to go to. At Lake George, she had a shanty. In New York, she had a separate studio, and you can't just leave your infant and go off to the studio. Somebody really has to be in charge of that. As a writer, I mean, we all know Jane Austen would slip the pages underneath the blotter. Writing is much more portable, and you can dip in and out of it more easily. Not that that's an easy thing to do, but I think she was right. And she wrote to one of her friends, I think in the 40s or early 50s, she would have friends come and stay with her out in the Southwest. And she said at one point, please don't bring your children. She said, I don't mean that in an unkind way, but this is a time when I'm painting and children are something like not restful or something like that. And she's right. And she was older then, so it's not as though she was in the throes of her childbearing years, but it would have been, I think she was O'Keefe. I think she would have done it. She would have continued to be an artist if she'd had children. And it was a period when everybody had more help. And Stieglitz lived in a world where there was help. I mean, there was a cook always at Lake George. She wouldn't have been by herself in the kitchen. But I think she's right, or I think you're right in saying that writing is something that's easier to incorporate into your life as a mother than painting would be. My daughter has 3 children, and she's a visual artist.
Wow.
And it's chaos. It's hard for her.
I wonder if there are any comments you'd like to make about your writing process, individual writing processes.
Well, it's a lot of work. It takes a long time. That's right.
Do you want to be more specific?
Yes.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, Ian Rankin mentioned a couple things I thought were just interesting about who his ideas of Fox, or anything you want to write in mystery, which I thought was inspiring, sociology, psychology, whatever it is, we all throw it in there. So maybe inspired by that, I thought, sort of quips you might put in a Writer's Digest or Psychology Today or your writing.
Can I sort of steer that to you, Dawn, in terms of, you said that you read 3 biographies inspired by the show, and so you steeped yourself in the life, the factual life as it was known. When you began the writing process of the novel, did you try to just leave that
Move away
behind,
from that?
take whatever you had internalized and focus on the drama of the storytelling?
Yep.
And then maybe go back later to
Yep.
clarify.
Yep. So in the first year of working on this book, once I decided that I felt like it was something I really wanted to do, I knew it was going to take me a long time, and I knew that I really needed to find the voice, because I knew from the beginning that I wanted to stay close to the facts. Actually, we had an early email exchange. With Roxana, and Roxana raised a question, and that was in 2009 or 10. It was early, and you raised the question, because I went back and I found it, and it was, can you tell me how you are going to be using the facts in your novel? Can you tell me, are you going to be staying close? Are you only going to be talking about true events that happened? And her asking that question, that was a question I really lived in. It's Rilke who says, about living in the question. I really lived in that question. How am I going to be working with the facts? But in that first year of, but I knew I wanted to write a first person account, because I wanted to get right up against, what O'Keefe felt, thought, saw, wondered, what she fought for, what she dreamed during that span of time when she lived with, with Stieglitz in New York. But I couldn't get the voice right away. I'd get little glimpses of what I thought the voice would be. I'd kind of fragment. I tend to write early pieces in fragments, but I just didn't have the voice of the story. And it's in marked contrast to the novel I'm writing now, which is another historical novel, which I had the voice immediately. I had it immediately. But with O'Keefe, it took me, and I think part of it was just feeling like I knew I was writing about a period of time in her life that she didn't really like to talk about as an older woman. And so I needed to kind of come to terms with that, and to really grasp why I felt that it was such an important time to explore in order to kind of feel that it was an okay, thing to do. But it took me time to find the voice of the novel. And in that first year, I actually read 7 or 8 biographies, and then I read 2 biographies of Stieglitz. And I read about 20 catalogs, with essays from curators and art historians. And I spent a lot of time with their art. And I did really, soak my way into it. But when I started writing, my early drafts are a mess. That's actually the way I would describe my process. My early drafts are all over the place. I don't write with punctuation. And I try to keep them that way, because I feel like the longer they are kind of raw, the easier it is to go in and break them open, and the more risks I'll take. And it's always easy to go back and clean things up and polish them up, and revise the structure and create it and make it more driving. But it's really hard to get the heart back into something when it's not there in the first place.
So just so that you understand that all writers feel the same way about everything, I do that when I write a novel. It's totally the opposite of what Donna does. I write a novel because I start out with a question, something I don't understand about, and there are a group of characters who are sort of present themselves around that, and I write the novel chapter by chapter. I don't go to the second chapter until the first chapter is perfect. So, and I will open every file and start in again on that chapter from the first sentence. So the first sentence in every chapter has been rewritten about 150 times. I will spend as who was it? It's Flaubert said he spent all day taking out one word out of a paragraph, and then today I spent putting it back in. And I will find myself taking out the same word, and then the next time putting that word back in. So totally different processes, just so you know.
We have time for one more question.
I'm interested in how you mingle fact and fiction. How did you go about that?
Me? How did I go about mingling fact and fiction? So I wanted to stay, as I was sitting with this question, because at the time when I asked that question, I was thinking about, when Roxana and I were emailing a long time ago, and it was a very brief email exchange. It was just like 3 or 4 emails. I was thinking about having one invented character who was an assistant to the older OKeefe. And I decided not to do that. Like, I wanted this book to be only, true events. If I was writing about a painting that she made, I wanted her to be painting it where she was painting it, in the time frame that she was painting it, in actual life. And I wanted it to be true events and circumstances, people only with real life characters, because I wanted to explore how OKeefe might have met or experienced those real events and circumstances, how she might have experienced them emotionally, experienced them psychologically. It was something. I feel like it's something that that when you're writing an historical novel, you have the liberty to do what a good biographer should never do, which is to attribute motive. That you can create. Does that make sense? That you can imagine why something takes place, in a character's head. And one of the things that I love so much about Roxana's biography, in contrast to a lot of what's been written about OKeefe, is Roxana never does that. You really stay. You keep that. It's so clean that you own where the facts end and what the limits, and what what might have been. And there are many other books written nonfiction, and I feel like there's some biographies of OKeefe that have taken more liberties than I took in my novel, except that I invent and I imagine, what might have taken place in dialogue, what might have been taking place in her head. What I did do also, after I finished a draft of the novel, I went back through the letters. And I would find little tiny things that they exchanged in their letters, and I would layer them into their dialogue, or I would layer them into her thought process, because I wanted to bring, you know, her actual voice in the letters, you know, into that combination effect and invention that was on the page.